In a recent Red Cross report, they called the situation alarming in 10 of the 14 provinces in Syria. There are 3,000 Syrian Arab Red Crescent volunteers, and they reach 2.5 million people each month with relief and aid. And they need to do this because there's a third of the population in need of desperate assistance. And this presents some huge challenges for the Red Cross. There's challenges to respecting the emblem when someone is moving about in their duties as a Red Crescent volunteer. They should be respected, and yet 22 Syrian Red Crescent volunteers have been killed while they were wearing their uniforms and performing their duties. And currently the Red Cross movement is calling for unimpeded access to the most needed areas to deliver aid, and also to allow civilians a safe route out of areas where conflict is raging.
I'd like to give you a little bit of a history of the Syrian Revolution in case you haven't been following it. The revolution started in March of 2011 after a group of young children scribbled some graffiti on their school walls. The graffiti read, "Freedom," and the people want to topple the regime. And the government of Bashar al-Assad responded by detaining and torturing those kids. The youngest child was 10, and the oldest was 16. The mothers of the children held sit-ins in front of the detention center, and the soldiers came and fired at them using live ammunition and said to the mothers, "Don't worry, we can make new sons with you." So this sparked a popular uprising. When the children were returned to their families, their nails had been pulled out, their fingernails had been pulled out, and their hands had been smashed. So the government of Bashar al-Assad chose to implement what they called a security solution to an Islamic uprising. Now, the fact of the matter is that since March of 2011, every week, Syria has witnessed peaceful protests in the thousands across the entire country. But as the revolution has gone on for 2.5 years, the security solution has escalated. And where the government once used live ammunition at protests and funeral marches, today they are dropping cluster bombs. They are flying over civilian areas with MiGs. They are bombing bakery lines. And as you probably know, they are using chemical weapons. As of today, we have documented more than 120,000 people killed. We have over 260,000 people who are missing, presumed to be in detention or dead. We have 5 million internally displaced people. Many of those 5 million have been displaced multiple times. We have 2 million refugees in neighboring countries, and that number is expected to reach 4 million, I believe, by the end of 2014. We have approximately 80% of the nation's infrastructure destroyed by bombs. We have children who have not been in school in 2.5 years. We have famine throughout the country. In particular, in the area that was recently the victim of the chemical weapons attack, the people are now starving to death. What you may not know from the media is that that area, independently of the chemical weapons attack, had been under regime siege for 325 days. The Assad regime routinely denies entry for humanitarian supplies. So this is a problem. Now, you probably don't know this because what you will typically see in mainstream media is a portrayal of a civil war, the regime against the Islamic fundamentalists. And I'm here to tell you I am not an Islamic fundamentalist, and I do represent the revolution, and I represent the civilian peaceful movement to overthrow a dictatorship. What you have in Syria today is a very healthy, nonviolent movement, the rebuilding of civil society that is fighting not just the Assad regime, but the Islamic fundamentalists that have come in from around the world. These are not limited to Syrians. The fundamentalists today come from Tunisia and Morocco and Ireland and the United States and France. They come from Australia, they come from Italy. They come from all over. What you have are some groups who became very disillusioned with the international community's treatment of Syria or the way they responded to the crisis in Syria and have become more radicalized. You have primarily what the media calls the rebels, the Free-Syrian Army, which is a secular group composed of former army soldiers who defected rather than shoot at unarmed protesters. And then you have your typical war commerce criminals. You have thieves and bandits and gangs. But what you have above all is some 20 million people caught in the crossfire between all of this. And they are working in an environment where international interests converge in Syria. You have the Russians and the Iranians and Hezbollah in Lebanon supporting the Assad regime. You have countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia supporting the fundamentalists. And you have very little actual material support that is helping civil society, civilian movements, the nonviolent movement, and the Free Syrian Army. So part of the work that I do with the local coordination committees and Free Syria is to empower and support civil society. Part of our work is to document what we call crimes against humanity. Part of our work is to condemn actions by rebel groups in the armed opposition where they are committing atrocities. And certainly our job is to inform and communicate about what is happening. With the foundation work, our primary focus is on women's empowerment, and we are launching a couple of different campaigns. One is called the Jasmine Tent, and we are setting up safe havens for women throughout the country. As you may or may not know, rape has been systematically used as a weapon of war, a weapon of terror in Syria, and I can go into that a little bit more in the discussion. The other project is raising funds to deliver cash to the hardest hit areas where children are literally starving to death. A big part of our work in Syria, as I said, has been condemning crimes against humanity. And in particular, I want to draw some attention to the recent kidnappings of American Red Cross workers in northern Syria by ISIS. You'll see ISIS in the news a lot, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The irony is that the majority of those fighters are neither Iraqi nor Syrian. The irony is that they come from all over to thrive on the chaos that Bashar al-Assad has created.
I think our friends here have given you the broad parameters of the big issues we are talking here about. The complexities of the conflict in Syria, the fact that it is no longer a domestic conflict, it's a proxy war where elements from outside are influencing what goes on there. In fact, the citizens of Syria are being buffeted about by forces beyond their country. And what does it mean, what is going on in terms of the business of humanitarian assistance and the international rule of law under which any action or intervention has to be based? Firstly, we've talked a bit about the international humanitarian law. Now, today the world isn't short of laws. We have the international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, which you've heard briefly mentioned, came out of the Battle of Solferino, the first Geneva Convention, 1850-something, right down to the modern day. And at the heart of this, of international humanitarian law, among its numerous other provisions, at the heart of it is really this notion that non-combatants, which means civilians and also wounded soldiers, they are immune from violence, and they have a right for protection. So it immediately raises the question as to what are the incentives and disincentives. We know that it's wrong to do certain things, and yet leaders and other fighters continue to do it. So, and we see this not just in Syria, we see this in many other countries, Sudan, for example. And this brings us to the second framework of law, which is about the legal framework that governs the work of the International Criminal Court, where certain crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against humanity, acts of genocide, and various other serious crimes of that ilk are offenses under international law to be tried by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So we have, therefore, this notion of accountability. If you do something wrong, then you will get prosecuted. So the question is, why are we not doing this in Syria? Why, for example, there isn't any strong action being taken to refer those who are committing these crimes against humanity to the relevant International Criminal Court and such like. And therein may lie the basis of some work that civil society groups can do. I want to also reflect a little bit on the fundamental principles as governing everything that the Red Cross does, Red Cross, Red Crescent, and not just the Red Cross, Red Crescent, but all major humanitarian organizations that have been guided by the growth of norms. In particular, what does the two most contentious humanitarian principles, that of neutrality and impartiality, mean in practical terms? So the word humanitarian contains the word human. And I think we need to reflect a bit on what does being humanitarian mean nowadays, in this century, as opposed to necessarily what was the case at the foundation of the Red Cross, and indeed how the Red Cross itself has grown up over time and developed these norms and their application in more modern times. It's the 150th anniversary about now, isn't it? So, you may not know this, well, you can guess it, that the Red Cross, Red Crescent system is older than most countries in the world. And it is quite amazing that the work done by what is essentially a voluntary organization commands the allegiance and respect of nation states. It is as if the nation states have recognized that they need to be curbed and controlled by some kind of popular expression of the citizens of the world. In essence, the story of the beginnings of Red Cross, Red Crescent that we heard about is a story that says, citizens are saying enough is enough, the rules of war and all those kinds of things. And in a way, as these Arab Springs and so on we are hearing all about, it is a sort of modern version of civilians all over the world actually looking at the state of the world and how it's being shaped and saying, okay, governments that are doing bad things doesn't mean that just because they're governments or states, they have some kind of divine right to, or authority or impunity to carry on those actions. So my principal point I'm trying to make here is, you as citizens or visitors to this nice little town, which I've seen for the first time today, don't go away thinking that this isn't your responsibility. This isn't something that governments can solve. This isn't something that aid workers can solve. This isn't something that the military can solve. It is essentially a question of thinking locally, acting globally. Normally the expression is thinking globally and acting locally. Actually, we need to reverse that. It's thinking locally and acting globally. Because here we are locally in this city, and what you described was a very local situation, people suffering in a very local environment. And the whole point of this evening is to connect the two localities. Whether you are in Ithaca, whether you are in Syria, it is the common citizenship, what the connections are in this globalized world where knowledge travels everywhere, where ideas cross the world at the press of a button, and so on and so forth. In this globalized world, therefore, the notion of humanitarianism as charity is long outmoded. People nowadays, and this is my experience of visiting countries like Syria, is that they are not just interested simply in receiving humanitarian relief. They're not interested in simply a bit of food here, a little bit of health, medical care there, a bit of water or medicine there. Of course, they need it, and of course they appreciate it, and of course it is our duty as part of the common humanity, one of the fundamental principles of the Red Cross, the principle of humanity, the overarching principle. Clearly, yes to that, but they're asking for much more. They're asking for justice, they're asking for accountability, and above all else, they are asking that the world should support them in their efforts to shape their own destinies. If you look back over the history of the last few decades, very often our external interventions, well-intentioned they might be at times, have had perverse outcomes. This is not to say that sometimes interventions are not needed. I'm talking about military and other interventions. But above all else, these interventions have taught us that the most important interventions to bring about change comes from within society itself. So as part of the humanitarian endeavor, as one actually becomes smart about how one provides assistance, even in the middle of a conflict, and this is what the Red Cross, the ICRC, and so on specialize in. Question being increasingly asked more and more is, what is being done to restore the word human within the word humanitarian? And the essence of being human is about respect and dignity. And that's my core point here, really. Today's humanitarian work and humanitarian assistance is not just about life-saving assistance. That, I think, goes without saying. But it's really challenging us to do much more than that. It is asking us, whoever we are, wherever we might be working, whether we are little or large, what influence we have or don't have as citizens or actors, it is to ask why people are suffering, why is the world standing by and allowing the suffering to take place, who is gaining, who is losing, because every conflict has its economy. Wars and conflicts, we know from long experiences elsewhere, they have a dynamic. Somebody's gaining, somebody's losing. And usually we know who's losing, it's the people, in a sense. So in modern terms, as we get involved in issues that might appear to be half a world away, and yet their impacts come home to us every day of our lives, and I think you can imagine the many ways they do so. So these conflicts in Syria or elsewhere, they're not kind of somewhere in some foreign land. They have a direct impact on our place in the world. So what that means is that we, 150 years on from the beginning of the Red Cross, need to rethink, not to rethink the interpretation of the fundamental principles. Fundamental principles remain as valid as ever: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, helping people according to their needs, helping people on the basis that all who need on any side of a conflict get helped, and putting the provisions of international humanitarian law into practice, and having accountability for those who break those particular laws. But going beyond that and saying, are there things we can do to actually deal with the underlying causes at the same time as continuing to provide humanitarian assistance? Now, this causes tensions. You agree that within the Red Cross and the wider humanitarian community, there is this constant tension between humanitarians and human rights people. So the humanitarians are very worried that if they speak up, they might compromise their actions. They might not be able to help because the warring groups may not trust them. And so very often you don't hear humanitarian organizations speaking up on behalf of the victims of humanitarian suffering, because it may be seen as partial. The human rights people, on the other hand, and there's a whole body of law which has grown up in more recent times following international humanitarian law. There's a whole body of human rights law which is much more assertive campaigning for the basic rights of citizens, including the right to live, including all this stuff that we take for granted. Now, the question is, for our generation, well, your generation, you're younger than me, is this: can we square this circle between human rights, justice, and fairness and dignity, everything that you and I would want in our lives here, right, with this altruistic humanitarian urge and this humanitarian way of working, which requires discretion when reaching out to all people involved in all sides of the struggle? I believe we can.
Does anyone on our panel want to comment on whether it's a civil war or something else?
I would like to comment. So traditionally, people think in a civil war there are two sides of an armed conflict, and they're battling back and forth for large areas of territory. We as activists, as Syrian activists, believe that what we have is a popular uprising against dictatorship and tyranny. Full stop. The revolution is one about freedom and dignity and democracy for all Syrians across the board. What we do have, however, is multiple warring factions that have come in, and I think I mentioned earlier, they are thriving on the chaos that the regime has created and perpetuated. What you also have is a confluence of foreign agendas, be they Russian and their strategic interests in the Mediterranean, be it Iran and its strategic interests, the Arab Gulf states, and Hezbollah. But in terms of the Syrian population, we say it's a popular uprising. It is not our civil war.
If this is an international conflict, why does the media portray it as a civil war?
There are probably a lot of different reasons, but from our perspective, it's very sexy to say that way over there are these jihadis fighting the government and chemical weapons, and it sells. Ordinary people can read the headlines and walk away. There's no responsibility because it's Arabs fighting Arabs. It's people have the misperception that these are conflicts that have been going on for thousands of years. People will say that the Assad regime is protecting minorities, therefore let the Muslims kill each other. This is what sells. The reality is the international community, people around the world, have failed to restore the word human in humanitarian or humanity. And we believe that this is an international problem because today it's Syria, yesterday it was Bosnia or Rwanda, right? And so this phenomenon that is happening in Syria happens around the world all the time. And it's time, I think, for humanity to redefine the conventions and the laws and work together to make sure that never again really is never again.
I don't know if Rafi, if you have other news sources, because, I was listening to the BBC. I thought I was getting a good global perspective, and they presented this So where else can we go to get better information on Syria?
Well, unfortunately, mainstream media will take the easy route and call it a civil war or a civil sectarian ethnic war. I can give you a quick anecdote. A major news outlet contacted me once and was asking about a high-ranking defector. And they said, is he Alawite? And I said, he's a high-ranking defector. Shouldn't that be the headline? What does his cultural or religious background mean to you? Don't make that the headline. So it's a little bit fabricated. I would encourage you to visit the local coordination committee's websites. We have Facebook pages, and then we also have the Violations Documentation Center, where we publish specific reports written by activists on the ground. The LCC is the largest network of civil society activists in Syria, and they are the most often cited in news. And you'll find some, it's not impartial reporting, but it will tell you the activist perspective. So I would encourage you to go there.
So how, and what stage are you with that non-violent approach to whether educating, mobilizing, and addressing this head-on? That's one question. And how effective will this be? I remember I was reading about the struggle in India, Gandhi and the British, and somebody said the reason that worked was because the British could be shamed. But how do you effectively resist when the opponent cannot be shamed?
At the beginning of the revolution, we have used creative nonviolence, civil disobedience in the revolution. Examples include launching ping pong balls off a mountaintop, and each ball had the word freedom or dignity or democracy written on it. We've staged sit-ins, we've done banging on pots and pans. Alternatively, we've had noise outs. We've had sick-ins, sick-outs, dress in all white, dress in all red, different types of strikes. As things have gotten militarized, and the reason the revolution became militarized in the beginning, after about 7 months of peaceful protest, was because army personnel could no longer fire on unarmed protesters, and they began defecting. You also had civilians wanting to defend their families. Too many men watched their mothers or sisters or daughters getting raped, gang raped in public. Too many children were forced to watch their mothers being raped. And so you had a growing sense of a need for self-defense. What we have done in response to that, because we understand, of course, the need for self-defense, is to create a code of conduct for the Free Syrian Army. And that code of conduct is based on international laws and the Geneva Convention, and has language around the treatment of prisoners of war, around the protection of cultural heritage sites, around defense of civilians. So that's how we have been responding to the armed part of the opposition. Now, even in the nonviolent movement, we recognize that the Assad regime will not be shamed, right? For the Assad regime, this is an existentialist battle, because what we're saying is we want to end not just 12 years of Bashar al-Assad rule, but 5 decades of Assad family rule. Single family, single party repression and dictatorship. And the Assad regime has said on multiple occasions that it will stop at nothing. And they're not lying. I mean, they have resorted to using chemical weapons. And what was reported in August of this year was not the first instance of chemical weapons use. We, in the LCC, had been reporting the use of chemical weapons since December of 2011 in multiple cities. So I don't think there is any way to shame this government. We are going to have to rely on international pressure or international intervention. And even in the nonviolent community, we recognize that the Assad regime will not go without force.
Hi, you referred to international intervention. How does it affect, let's say, U.S. and Russia, they're negotiating
it's devastating because this schizophrenic thing, they're going to help, no, they're not going to help. They're going to help, tomorrow they'll help, no, they're not going to help. And I think over the past 2.5 years, the Syrian people have felt entirely abandoned by everybody. From the very beginning of the revolution, the United States government said that it was in support of the people's bid for freedom and dignity and democracy. President Obama stood up and said, President Assad must step down. And of course, the Syrian people rejoiced, and that spurred on the protests because we had international support. And as we documented more and more human rights violations and crimes against humanity, the world was outraged, and we had first condemnations, then strong condemnations, then condemnations in the strongest possible terms, but nothing actually made an impact. When there were first news items about a possible airstrike, we saw massive new defections among the regime's armed forces. And so we were thinking, all right, with the threat of a foreign intervention, a US-led airstrike, perhaps we can see an internal coup. Perhaps the inner circle protecting Assad will turn on the Assad regime itself and will be done. Morale on the ground? Today they are starving. The secular rebels known as the FREE-Syrian Army have do-it-yourself weapons. They're fighting Russian-provided MiGs. They're fighting cluster bombs. They're fighting chemical weapons. When it comes to chemical weapons, what does it matter who used them? The fact is, there is a civilian population being attacked by chemical weapons. But you have to ask yourself, who has the capacity to control the world's third largest stockpile of chemical weapons, if not a government? When rockets are being fired from regime-controlled territory into opposition-held territory, and those rockets contain chemical weapons, who is actually perpetrating the crime? So in a way, it's not really who has the weapons, it's that they're being used to begin with. And do we close our eyes to the amount of atrocity that's been committed so far and continuing? I hope that answers.
If there is to be an international intervention, as at one time it was hoped, then the lesson learned from other interventions is that you've got to do it properly. What you can't have an intervention like, you can't sit in an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean, shove a few cruise missiles and go to lunch. That's a cowardly war. Today's wars cannot be fought like that. I am convinced from my 30 years of experience of working in conflict and crisis in the UN as an official of the British government and latterly in the Red Cross Federation, that change ultimately and only comes from within. And I'm very sorry to say to my Syrian sisters and brothers that the lesson of history is that every time the people have won their freedoms, it has been their own struggle that has brought it about. The best we can ask the external world to do is, please don't make our job worse, if you like. If you can't help us, be honest and say you can't help us, and let us then take charge of our own destiny. Rather than what is happening in the ups and downs of the last few years, you promise help, when people kind of have the strategy to do that promise, you break that promise, and then people are left far worse off than they were before. So I think, above all else, what we need is truthfulness and honesty about the capabilities of nations, including this one, in terms of influencing what goes on outside.
I do want to point out that the Syrian opposition has never asked for US boots on the ground. What the Syrian armed opposition has requested is weapons. And what we have requested is to shift the balance of power on the ground. Where international dialogue can help is if Russia would stop sending more attack helicopters, MiGs, cluster bombs, other weapons of mass destruction to Syria. That would be very helpful. Or if Hezbollah soldiers or Iranian soldiers would be persuaded to leave, or if jihadists coming from around the world could be persuaded to leave. We will have change from within. Ultimately, I agree with that, but it's very difficult to effect change from within when you are dealing with multiple armed enemies. And what you have essentially are sticks and stones, and you're dealing with modern warfare. So that's an important point to consider, and I think previous revolutions did not face this level of brutality.
Yeah, I just wanted to, not necessarily to wrap up things or summarize stuff, but just to sort of intervene on a couple of points. I wouldn't ask you to rule out the idea of an armed intervention or of those kinds of devices. And one of the reasons not to rule them out is also not to have a mistaken idea of what the Red Cross is. The Red Cross is not a pacifist organization. The Red Cross accepts the fact that there is war and that there is conflict. And if you are someone who, believes in working for peace only in nonviolent and peaceful ways, and that's it, you will be disappointed by some of the things that the Red Cross tries to do or some of the principles that it's hold. Keep that in mind. The Red Cross is used to, in its whole history, it has worked with governments, and governments are violent things, and they do violent things. But one of the great advantages of the Red Cross, and I think that Dr. Kapila also pointed that out as well, is that the Red Cross is probably the most effective organization, if not the only organization in the world, that can say it is both a humanitarian and a human rights organization. It defends both. It defends the rights of a soldier wounded, an individual soldier, not because that soldier is an Italian soldier or an Austrian soldier or whatever. It defends those rights. It defends those rights, but at the same time, it is a humanitarian organization. It has come to be a protector of civilians as well. Its role has expanded since 1863, 1864, since those conventions, to include lots of things that involve civilians. So when civilians find themselves in a war area, they can ask for the protection of the Red Cross. The other thing the Red Cross can learn how to do very well is to demonstrate that they understand the need for confidentiality. They're the people you can trust to do that. It's a big problem in every profession, whatever you're going into, and certainly in my profession and in the medical profession, confidentiality and not violating its rules. That's also what the Red Cross is all about. Some other organizations have tried to imitate that and do that as best they could, but they run into situations like Human Rights Watch did in Iraq, where they feel it's time to, in fact, break that kind of confidentiality and sort of tell what we think is happening in Abu Ghraib. In any case, you have then those kinds of things ahead of you as the techniques that you need to learn. At the same time, that I would say don't list the Red Cross and working with the Red Cross as kind of another profession, like, real estate or sports management or something. It's very different in that way, in that in the international field certainly, and sometimes also in disaster relief in the American field, it's dangerous. So you've got to commit yourself to something. That was driven home to me when I met someone who I came to respect and love very much as an actor in homelessness in Ithaca. She was a West Point graduate. All right, so in other words, when a West Pointer doesn't take their career decisions lightly, and they think about that. And I think in Terry Reid's case, she also knew that, one way or the other, I'm going to be up against danger. I might as well make it worth something. But I think by doing it in the Red Cross way, the way I feel to do it, that's what I would say. Keep in mind those kinds of things. Keep in mind the special aspects of Red Cross action. And if you want to get into what we could do in a non-violent way, in a policy way in Syria, I'll do that, but maybe not tonight.
Thanks, John. My question is how you personally articulate how the Red Cross weighs short-term human suffering versus long-term human suffering.
Sometimes when you have the most serious must always do the right thing, for the people in front of you. And if you start trading off the rightness of today against the wrongness of tomorrow or the other way around, then almost certainly you get it wrong. This is because as history unfolds, externalities get in the way. We think if we act in this way, the action will be this, and history will go in that direction. Almost always, history doesn't unfold in the way we think that we can make history unfold. So what that means is that unpredictable things happen as a result of policies being made, not because they're bad or good policies, but the fact is that the world evolves in unpredictable ways. Under those circumstances of uncertainty about tomorrow, it is always better to act in the correct way in the now for the current. And that, I think, is at the core of what the Red Cross policy is, which is, you don't care whether it's a 100-year-long war or whether it is a 100-day war, you have to do the right thing.
Perspective from the Assad regime's side, there's a very, very dirty game being played. Certainly a population is being starved to death, and this is a move designed to eliminate those opposed to the Assad regime, but also to bring the opposition to its knees. The opposition is largely in exile because we cannot operate freely inside Syria. Just the fact that I'm speaking to you here tonight puts yet another execution order on my head if I'm ever caught inside. So imagine an entire opposition operating from within their own country. So the Assad regime is playing this very dirty game. The other thing that prolongs the issue of negotiations is this chemical weapons issue. If you remember, before the August attacks, the Assad regime denied having chemical weapons. Today, they're allowing UN inspectors to go in and dismantle the very chemical weapons they didn't have. Today, Assad is almost becoming an international partner in this effort to dismantle these awful weapons. And so he's been very tricky and he's been very successful in turning the game in his favor. And I think he will do this to bring about negotiations that he will not participate in, because he's not going to negotiate himself out of power. But it's a dirty game.
Well, one thing that hasn't been raised is the issue of no-fly zone. And the reason I'm raising that is, assuming the chemical weapons are dismantled, assuming the people of Syria should decide in the future, what stops the divided opposition from gaining global momentum in pursuing the no-fly zone based strictly at the military? There's a precedent for that in Iraq, there's a precedent for that in Libya. Would that be the best way to save the growing casualties, the civilian population, from all this relentless assault?
Some will say it didn't work in Iraq. They will say it didn't work in Libya because look at the Russian backlash. The Russians felt cheated in Libya. Some will say that enforcing a no-fly zone is far too costly. Others will say, by what authority will who enforce a no-fly zone? Is it by NATO? Is it by UN Security Council vote, which will be vetoed by the Russians immediately? So how do you implement a no-fly zone? And did I say that some say a no-fly zone will kill more civilians than protect? These are questions that the international community has been debating publicly for 2.5 years. I don't think the United States or any of the friends of Syria, the so-called friends of Syria, are prepared to commit the resources or the time to enforcing a no-fly zone. I think it's very simple. They don't want to be involved, so they'll pay lip service. They'll send several $100 million worth of aid. It will get stuck at borders. People will suffer. But in the final analysis, the Syrians and the Iraqis and the Tunisians and the Irish and the French will have to sort it out themselves. I don't think there is any world appetite to enforce a no-fly zone. And this is what the Syrian opposition, mainstream, feels it needs to overthrow the Assad regime. So we're at an impasse.
Almost every week there is a convoy that leaves France, Switzerland, that kind of area. And this is the Syrian diaspora in that part of Europe, collecting resources, buying up ambulances, and then they run the convoy through Turkey, and it takes 2 days to travel there, and they cross the border. I've got many friends, many Syrian friends, who do that. I'm thinking of doing it, accompanying them on these trips myself. And the point I'm trying to make is, we mustn't look upon the Syrians as helpless victims. Terrible things are happening, and what you've said it with great calmness and great moderation. You could have said it in a different way as well. You see, terrible things are happening. But what is extraordinary is the solidarity of groups outside, and also the courage of those who somehow managing to wriggle their way through the system, providing help in quite difficult locations. And the only other day I was talking to a Syrian student who is in the University of Manchester, where I'm also based, and he's doing a little project with ICRC on actually educating the armed opposition groups, international humanitarian law, figuring out with them in their circumstances, meaning what happens is the opposition groups then bring certain scenarios. What do we do when fighting takes place in a heavily built up area? What are the actual tactics to use as you pursue your military objectives? As we agree, it is not a question of a war being justified or not justified, war is happening. So when we talk about IHL in that context, it is not simply about the norms and values, which I think we are all in favor with, but figuring out the application of that in the practical operational program. Now for the humanitarian organizations, it is also about, because it's difficult for Western organizations to cross borders, take risks, and all the other stuff that I think Western organizations have to do. There are lots that can be done through local organizations. And local capacity building, working locally through local trusted channels is an option on which much, much more can be done than is being done at the moment.
I'm curious from all or some of you, if you would share why. What is the reward? And when did you decide to make the sacrifices that you have?
Why you did what you did in your life? Oh my goodness. You answer first, then I'll think about it.
That's a problem.
I actually know Bashar al-Assad personally. I know him fairly well. And I was so appalled when he gave the order to shoot live ammunition at unarmed women who were demonstrating for their son's release. So I went berserk and I joined the Syrian Revolution. And I got more and more involved and eventually took on more and more positions within the opposition. The reason I keep doing this, many reasons, but I'll give you a little anecdote. The last time I was in Syria, I was smuggled in and I went into a refugee camp that housed 40,000 people at the time. Today it houses well over 70,000. There was one kitchen serving 40,000 people. The ceiling was not attached to the walls because they couldn't do that. The floor was made of mud. And volunteers were cooking one meal a day for 40,000 people. There were 40 bathrooms. 40 bathrooms for 40,000 people. And as I was doing my tour with members of the LCC, and it was a fact-finding mission, it was verification of needs so we could know how to leverage Syrian expatriate groups to bring in the cash, because we're willing to smuggle it in. As we were doing our tour, a little 8-year-old girl came up to me and held my hand. She was wearing mismatched boots because a generous donor had gone to thrift shops to collect shoes and didn't care that the pairs were mismatched. And this little girl had to suffer the indignity of wearing mismatched shoes. This was a gift. It was better than going barefoot. And we walked along, and this child was absolutely filthy because she'd been living in a refugee camp without running water for months. And I didn't know if I was going to catch a disease and bring it home to my children. And I realized that I would rather cut off my arm before I would reject this child. So we held hands throughout the tour, and at the end of the tour she said, "Are you coming to live with us in the refugee camp?" And that was my moment, and that continues to be my moment, because she is my moral compass. And I do what I do for her and for her generation, so that my generation who was not able to live in Syria in freedom and dignity and democracy, to give them the tools so that they might. And that's what drives me.
In 1947, India and Pakistan were formed. Do you remember? I mean, you weren't born, most of you, but you know about partition, don't you? And 1 million people got killed in that partition when people went from Pakistan to India and the other way around. And until Rwanda in 1994, it was the fastest rate of killing until Rwanda broke that horrible record 50 years later. So my grandmother tells the story of how she and her 10 children, including my teenage father, went on one of these trains that went from Pakistan to India, in our case, and other way around. And you've seen, I think, movies, Gandhi and all those movies. And she describes, and what happened with these trains was that trains would start out with living people, these are cattle trains and goods trains, and by the time they got to their destination, one country or the other, they were just dead bodies. Now, she was lucky. So she talks about how the whole train, I don't know, it must have had several thousand people on it, were protected by a man armed with nothing more than a Red Cross flag. I mean, today it is scarcely credible to think that the moral power was so strong that the blood-crazy crowds could be repelled by that. But apparently, my grandmother describes, when she's dead now, but in very lusty terms, of how this young man sort of thrust his Red Cross flag at the front of the train. And that's how the train survived. That's how my teenage father survived. And that's how subsequently I came to be born. So I don't know how to answer your question other than to say that maybe there are forces that take place in everyone's lives. And then those forces or those events propel you down certain directions. And often you are not even sure yourself whether there is any direction at all. You're simply kind of hopefully going in doing something. But simply to say there's a connectivity of our past and of our present. In my case, it was a real kind of coming together. It was almost as if I was destined to one day work in that particular area. And that's what the forces are propelling me